Peace, everybody. Today, I want to talk about black culture in the United States of America and how our culture has been mutated, it has been tampered with, it has been sabotaged, and we have to go back to a situation in which we can measure today into a situation that wasn't tampered with prior to the so called civil rights movement. The black culture was traditionally ruled by the men. The black man was the person who ran the culture. The black man had an image that was honored. He was known as the American Negro. And the black man had the Negro Leagues. He was the Tuskegee Airmen. He was the scholar, the worker, the inventor. Negro excellence was the culture. And then we had the civil rights movement, in which the talented tent finally came into prominence to lead the so-called black culture into salvation. And their idea of salvation is integrating with Caucasian white people. Now, this was accomplished by people like Dr. Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, and the like. And they had a clash with the black nationalists at the time. The Dr. I would say the most honorable Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X. It was a clash, and then it was an amalgamation when the so-called uh, talented tent was uniting with the black nationalists, and this was prevalent after the death of Martin Luther King because he started to click up with Elijah Muhammad and J. Edgar Hoover. He was the one that sabotaged the civil rights movement, saying that their whole objective was to the prevention of a black messiah who can electrify and unify the black population. And Dr. Martin Luther King could have been such a messiah if he would abandon his integrationalist ideology and embrace black nationalism. And when he started showing signs that he was embracing black nationalism and started talking about economic power and redistribution, they had to get rid of him because he manifested this black messiah that embraced black separatism and black nationalism because the black people was united at the time, the men and women, and they had massive economic power. So the Black Panther Party was led by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Johnson. No. It was Huey P. Newton and a guy from New York, whatever his name is, H. Rap Brown and Hutton, Bobby Hutton, little Bobby Hutton, whatever. But Huey P. Newton was a talented tent, just like Dr. Martin Luther King, but he totally united with the black nationalist movement. And then he led a contingency, a group of intelligent young black men and women all across the United States and had chapters, the Black Panther Party, right? This was towards the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. And then when Fred Hampton in Chicago, the youngest one of the youngest ones, most charismatic, the most powerful leader, the most eloquent leader, when they got rid of him, then the Black Panther Party changed. And it started to say, okay, we're going to be less so-called violent. We're going to be less about having guns. We're going to be more about being ideological. And also we're going to be more about the women taking leadership roles, Angela Davis and whatnot. And we're going to help the women succeed. Like all of the Black Power movements, all of the civil rights movements, all of the organizations started to focus on the women, the black women. Like they need to be in charge. They need to be the leader. And then the black women, they took that role, that mantle, and they united with the Caucasian women in the women's liberation movement. And during the time of the liberation movement, the United States government started to pass laws saying that they would give these women money, housing, whatever, if they was to be separate, if they was to separate themselves from the men, if they was to get divorced, and if they would have children out of wedlock. So at this point, the black culture changed. Now these children that these women, because they succeeded in kicking these men out the house, because a lot of these black men was in Vietnam, they came back on drugs. When they did the Civil Rights Act, a lot of black businesses went out of business. They closed their businesses, or when Martin Luther King got killed, a lot of black businesses was destroyed. And then a lot of black businesses moved out the community because they had a chance to go out to, go to the Caucasian community. So it was a massive economic and brain drain from the community of the ones who could, the haves. So all the haves left the community and left the have-nots, the poorer black people who couldn't lead the community. And then the poorer black man who didn't have money or education, they were abandoned by the women because they was kicked out the house. They was totally forgotten. And from my perspective, you use your reasoning, the United States government wanted to cut off that lineage from the evolved black people, the black man evolution, because you had the so-called talented tent actually linked up with the black nationalists and formulated a common goal after so-called integration, showing that it wasn't working. They was going towards self-determination and building for self and forcing the government to do what they supposed to do according to the Constitution. So this black man that was created, that was evolved from slavery up until this point in the late 1960s, early 1970s, this black man was cut off from the black family. And then from that point on, a small minority of black families actually had two-parent homes in which this so-called black man that derived from the 1930s, 40s, 50s actually was able to pass information on and example on to today's generation. Very few of us actually have a father figure that go back that far. So the so-called single mothers, the black women who was in charge of the black family, the government required that they had to be poor, uneducated, and having babies out of wedlock in order to get this money. So the vast majority of black women ascribed to be uneducated and broke and to get these babies. And the way they was getting these babies was just any random dude, street dude, the ones who was left over after the people after the so-called middle class, upper class blacks abandoned the community. They left the drug addicts, they left the so-called lower value men in the community, the street gang members, the drug dealers, the pimps. They was the ones that didn't lead the community, and these was the ones that was impregnating these black women in these project complexes that the government created for these black women, or these Section 8 ghettos, right? So these children that was coming out the community didn't probably know who their fathers were. They didn't have a father in the household, and a mother was they had a different criminal element in and out the house. And a lot of these mothers was actually on drugs too. So this is what I'm saying. The culture was mutated, in which the boys modeled themselves after who they saw in the community, which was pimps and drug dealers and gangsters. And the girls modeled themselves after their mothers, who was, on drugs, who didn't value their bodies. It was giving themselves up to any man just to get pregnant, to get this government welfare. And also, they had to be broke with low education just to qualify, because the black families who were, two-parent households, the government gave them no money whatsoever. In those two-parent households in which the government gave them no money, even if they decided to stay married, those children usually got educated. They went to college, the daughters might have became this. The sons could have been victimized by the streets, or they could have got educated or become police officers or whatever. But you still notice that the success rates of the black community was reduced because the two-parent households has decreased, and then the black children who was raised by these single mothers, they was doomed to failure unless they found mentorship programs, or unless they had an uncle or grandfather or somebody else who they can model themselves after. It had to be some outside, like in a Willie Lynch letter, they say this will continue forever unless a outside phenomena come and knock it off its axis. So it wasn't easy for the children of these single mothers who wasn't married, who had to the prerequisites to get this money. You had to be uneducated and broke, poor. So even if you had an opportunity to get a decent paying job, you was fearing that you was going to lose your food stamps and your housing. So that kept the women at a lower level. And then a lot of times the women couldn't go out there and get jobs because there was nobody to take care of the children. This was before they had home alone laws. Like the home alone laws actually came about in the 1990s. People like Bill Clinton, Joe Biden started to actually mandate that if a child was left home alone, the parents would go to jail if they had parents, or the parent would go to jail. And in 1996, Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, them made laws requiring that the women who was getting welfare since the 70s, they had to now go to they had to have jobs now, a minimum paying job, and then the government would pay for their child care. So they had to get a person babysitting. So in the 70s, they kicked the man out the house. In the 1990s, they kicked the women out the house. But the culture has evolved from what it was in the 1940s, where the black man image was powerful, the Negro, the great American Negro, world renowned, Tuskegee Airmen, liberating whole countries, inventor, scholar, father man, family man. Now the black man has been reduced because the young children have been cut off from that image. They have been cut off from knowing or modeling themselves because the upper class Negro after 1965, they moved out the community. The doctor, the lawyer, the business owner, they all abandoned the black community. The ones who was left over, who had most of the children, was the women, in which the government told them you had to be a single mother to get this money, and you had to be uneducated, you had to be broke and poor in order to live in these ghettos, these poverty controlled ghettos that the government created, these project complexes. Now the children who was born from that, they was observing the people in the community, the Arab running the businesses, the men on drugs, gang banging, shooters, killers, and pimps, and a mother just sleeping with anybody because promiscuity became necessary in order to them to get these babies out of wedlock. So that became part of the culture, being promiscuous and being a single. The baby mama was created. The thug was created. The thought was created because the girls watched their mothers be promiscuous. They started doing this. Teenage mothers getting babies. Nothing wrong with at least the only good thing that actually came about from all of this, even though our culture is messed up. You know, the young boys watching gangsters run the community, people that came back from Vietnam who didn't have access to opportunities, who knew how to kill, knew how to sell drugs, knew how to do drugs. They was the ones who ran the black community, and the boys modeled themselves after them, and they was joining their organizations, and their whole idea was about making money, selling drugs, and killing each other. This was created. This whole idea was really cultivated in the 1970s, and this is the culture that we see right now. It's a mutation, and it's really the government is responsible for this. The senators, the congressmen, the president who signed the laws, the bills, the judges, crime bills. All of this was to destroy the black family because they saw the power that the black family had, and if the black man's image was actually elevated and allowed to flourish and to grow naturally, he could really conquer and control the world, especially if he adopt black nationalism. But what we have now is a situation in which this whole culture that we have, this black culture, this hip hop culture, this is a mutation. This is actually a mistake. You see what I'm saying? the boys don't even know about Booker T. Washington. They don't even know about the Negro leagues, the black banks, the Black Wall Street, because we have been cut off from that historical line. We've been cut off from our own history, and we don't have access to the knowledge that was supposed to be passed down to us, because the men was forced out of the house, who couldn't leave by voluntarily, because they didn't have the money. They was lower class people. The upper class Negroes, the Bill Cosbys, the Philip Randolphs, the Sidney Poitiers, the middle class Negroes, they abandoned the black community. They abandoned Bronzeville. They abandoned Harlem. They moved to Caucasian communities. So they deprived the even if the black people, even if the black woman was raising children by themselves, if the so-called upper class Negroes never left, the actors, the athletes, the lawyers, if they would have never left, the children could have still modeled themselves after more than just drug dealers and pimps, prostitutes, and their mothers could have actually uh, had access to one of those high earning men, and could have took them off of having to be on welfare. You see what I'm saying? But the fact that there was no real, affluent men in the black community, these women was just dealing with drug dealers whose lifespan was very low, or their chances of going to prison and being, you know, on drugs was very high. So the chances of these children having a male figure that they could model themselves after, that was respectable and honorable for a long period of time, was decreased drastically. But it's really, the blame is solely, I would say the blame is on the black people who abandoned the black community, more so of the conditions, because they abandoned the black women and the children. The affluent, upper class, middle class black people who just didn't want to be with the black people no more. And people like Percy Julian, who moved to Oak Park. All of the black doctors and lawyers, inventors, did not stay in the black community. The actors, they left the black people to be destroyed by the government policies. And this is why our culture has been mutated, and it has to be restructured. And the way for it to be restructured is for the information about the people who existed before the mutation has to be taught. Those images have to be shown to the young people, so they can model themselves after more than just gangster rappers and pimps and killers, drug dealers, stuff like that. And the girls shouldn't model themselves after women like Ida B. Wells, and not a rapper like Meg Thee Stallion or Little Kim. Some promiscuous, sleazy type of female figure. They need to have more access to more, they call it archetypes, or what they call it, they should have more access to more behavioral cues, because there's a lot of different ways to react to a situation. But if your information is limited, then your reaction is limited also. And your role models, if you have a vast array of role models, you have more options as far as how your personality can be developed, as opposed to just being about, killing and stealing and criminality, being broke, hitting licks, hustles, the limited views of our own selves. That's one of the biggest problems. And then the view of ourselves that's being portrayed to the community is manipulated by white people, the media, the government. So we need more access to more independent media with a vast variety of ideologies, instead of just being a black liberal, a Democrat, being about criminal reform instead of economic reform. And the people who have the resources need to come back to the black community because they owed their success to the black community, but they abandoned it. So they owe even more now. The Bill Cosbys of the world, they should give everything they have to fixing the problem that they helped to create when they abandoned the black communities all over the United States. That's about it though.